This is the first of a two-part video series on the topic of explicating poetry. And this part is getting started. The second part will be about figurative language. The images in both videos come from my favorite artist, a French symbolist artist named Odilon Redon. I love his work, and it's appropriate for the subject of this presentation. So before we get started here, I'm going to read this poem by Elizabeth Bishop, The Man Moth. This is an early poem of hers. I think it's from her first collection, North and South, which was published in 1946. And I'm going to refer back to this poem throughout this video series. So I'd like for you to follow along as I read it, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Man Moth, newspaper misprint for Mammoth. Here above, cracks in the buildings are filled with battered moonlight. The whole shadow of man is only as big as his hat. It lies at his feet like a circle for a doll to stand on, and he makes an inverted pen, the point magnetized to the moon. He does not see the moon. He observes only her vast properties, feeling the queer light on his hands, neither warm nor cold, of a temperature impossible to record in thermometers. But when the man moth pays his rare, although occasional, visits to the surface, the moon looks rather different to him. He emerges from an opening under the edge of one of the sidewalks and nervously begins to scale the faces of the buildings. He thinks the moon is a small hole at the top of the sky, proving the sky quite useless for protection. He trembles, but must investigate as high as he can climb. Up the facades, his shadow dragging like a photographer's cloth behind him, he climbs fearfully, thinking that this time he will manage to push his small head through that round, clean opening and be forced through, as from a tube, in black scrolls on the light. Man standing below him has no such illusions. But what the man moth fears most he must do, although he fails, of course, and falls back, scared but quite unhurt. Then he returns to the pale subways of cement he calls his home. He flits, he flutters, and cannot get aboard the silent trains fast enough to suit him. The doors close swiftly. The man moth always seats himself facing the wrong way, and the train starts at once at its full, terrible speed, without a shift in gears or a gradation of any sort. He cannot tell the rate at which he travels backwards. Each night he must be carried through artificial tunnels and dream recurrent dreams. Just as the ties recur beneath his train, these underlie his rushing brain. He does not dare look out the window for the third rail. The unbroken draught of poison runs there beside him. He regards it as a disease he has inherited the susceptibility to. He has to keep his hands in his pockets, as others must wear mufflers. If you catch him, hold up a flashlight to his eye, its all dark pupil, an entire night itself, whose haired horizon tightens as he stares back and closes up the eye. Then from the lids one tear, his only possession, like the bee's sting, slips. Slyly he palms it, and if you're not paying attention, he'll swallow it. However, if you watch, he'll hand it over, cool as from underground springs and pure enough to drink. So we'll get started with some preliminary things. Once you have chosen a poem to explicate, give yourself time to read it several times. It's a good idea to choose a poem you actually like because you're gonna read it a lot. Read it once or twice. then put it aside, wait a few hours, maybe a few days if you have time, and then read it again. Once you have a general sense of the poem, take the time to circle unfamiliar words and look them up. Write down questions next to lines that fascinate you or that puzzle you, and jot down your ideas as they occur. What does the poem make you think about? Having done that, you're going to begin your explication with a basic description of the poem, how it looks on the page or screen, how many lines does it have, is it divided into stanzas? A stanza is a group of lines separated from neighboring lines by a space. And stanza breakage is often determined by rhyme patterns, particularly in older poems, but poets sometimes have other reasons. As a reader, think about how line and stanza breaks affect your interpretation of the poem. So if it is divided into stanzas, how many are there? Are they the same length? Does the poem rhyme? Rhyme in poetry is a very complicated subject. There are several different kinds of rhyme, and many poetic forms are identified with certain set rhyme patterns. The most common type of rhyme is end rhyme, which occurs when the last word or syllable of a line rhymes with the last word or syllable of another line in close proximity to it. If it does rhyme, if your poem does rhyme, is there a regular pattern of rhyming words? And since The Man Moth is not a rhyming poem, I just picked a poem from another poet that I like, someone who's very good at rhyming, the Victorian poet, English poet, Algernon Swinburne. So I just picked a short stanza here. And when you read it, you'll notice that it's got several rhymes. There's the first one. The first line ends with the word laurel, and it rhymes with the word sorrel. So when we write about rhyme, we identify the patterns by assigning letters to the rhyming words. So we'll call laurel and sorrel the A rhymes. The next line ends with the, and it has a rhyme. It actually rhymes with the next line, which ends with C. We'll call that the B rhyme. And then the next line that doesn't have a rhyme tied to it ends with the word weave. And it rhymes with the sixth line, which ends with eve. So we'll call that the C rhyme. And Swinburne also helps the reader visualize his rhyme scheme with these indents that you see on the left. And that's quite common with older poets, to create these indented lines to help the reader visualize the rhyme pattern. So here's Bishop's poem, The Man Moth, again. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of it. The poem has 6 stanzas, and each stanza is 8 lines long. So they're all the same length, and it's a total of 48 lines. The lines are all roughly the same length, except for the first line of each stanza, which is rather strange. And if I were to write a full explication of this poem, I'd want to explain that. Why did the first lines of each of the 6 stanzas, why are they so short? Just 2, 3, 4, 5 lines. These shorter lines are also indented, which really makes them stand out on the page. And as I pointed out, the poem has no apparent rhyme scheme. Remember, stanza and line breakage is important when it comes to quoting and citing poetry. If the lines are not numbered for you, you will have to count them yourself for your parenthetical citations. Mark breakage in your quotes with forward slashes. So I'll give you some examples of some citations. Here's one with integrated quotes. Includes subways of cement from line 26 and artificial tunnels from line 34. There's another way of doing this. One could just put them both together in one parenthetical citation. Generally, I discourage beginning writers from doing this because it can be a little misleading. You got to be very careful with this. But it does look cleaner to just go ahead and include both lines in one parenthetical citation. Neither one of these is wrong. But again, just be careful. You always want to aim for the greatest clarity in your parenthetical citations. Here's another quotation. This one is also just integrated into a sentence, and you can see the forward slash there indicating the line break, and then my parenthetical citation for it at the end. Here's another one. This one's different. I include the double slash mark, which indicates a stanza break. And then the regular forward slash indicates the line break. You'll also notice I put ellipsis at the beginning. I felt it was important here to let the reader know that this was not a complete line, that I was coming in the middle of a line. It's not always necessary to do that. It's kind of a judgment call. I felt like it was important to let the reader know that this was an interrupted line in case it's not obvious already. So I want to talk now about the poetic context. We've got the structure, done some of the preliminary work. Let's talk a little bit about genre, persona, and audience. And I'll define each of these terms, starting with genre. Poems come in many forms, defined by such features as line length, rhyme scheme, and subject matter. But for this class, for the sake of simplicity, we will deal with two very broad categories of poems. We'll talk about narrative poetry and lyrics. It is sometimes hard to tell the difference. So you've got to ask yourself, is the emphasis in this poem on what happens, or is the emphasis on what the speaker thinks or feels about it? So a narrative poem, you can think of it this way, a narrative poem will tell a story. There will be a setting, there will likely be multiple characters, there will be conflict and climax, all the things you would normally expect from a story. And so while narrative poems tend to be driven by plot, lyric poems are more expressive, and they're driven by the feelings and ideas of the speaker. Which brings us to the next term that you see on the screen here, the persona. Whether a poem is narrative or lyric, it is spoken by someone. It may be written in the voice of the poet himself, but you should never assume that. Oftentimes, poets adopt the voice of a fictional speaker or modulate their voice to shape readers' perceptions. Never assume that the poet is speaking to you as himself or in his natural voice. Ask yourself, how does the writer wish to be perceived? Now, finally, we'll talk about audience. Nor should you assume that the writer had you specifically in mind as his reader. Poems are frequently addressed to a specific person, or perhaps a group of people, particularly if it's an older poem. As you study your poem, look for details that suggest the writer had a particular audience in mind. Understanding the poem's purpose can also help you to pinpoint its implied audience. And I highlighted purpose there. We're going to talk about that next. But first, we're going to talk about the genre, persona, and audience of our poem, The Man Moth. So although the man moth does certain things, and I'm talking about the figure of the man moth, the character of the man moth, he climbs buildings, he uses the subway, but I would not call this poem narrative. It doesn't really tell a story. We do get descriptions of the man moth's environment and some of his behaviors, but the emphasis in the poem is much more on what the speaker observes and thinks about him. So I would categorize it as a lyric poem. As for persona, while the speaker in the poem seems to be Elizabeth Bishop herself, She comes across as an anthropologist or a scientist, perhaps a cryptozoologist, someone more interested in observing and studying the man moth than interacting directly with him. So, despite the figurative language, her tone is relatively unemotional, detached. She comes across as a city dweller herself, and perhaps she even identifies on some level with the man moth. And finally, in the last stanza of the poem, a very unique last stanza, the poet addresses the reader directly, for the first time, actually, in the poem, using the second person pronoun you, if you catch him. That's in line 41. By doing so, she seems to be speaking to other adult city dwellers, to those who share space with the man moth. I mean, those are the only people who would be able to catch him. She seems to invite the reader to acknowledge him, to connect with him in some way. In the last stanza, perhaps she thinks that her readers are on some level like the man moth and hopes that in him they recognize something of themselves. So I want to go back to this idea of purpose. It is important to understand the overall purpose of the poem. Explication is going to require you to think about the objectives of the poem. What does the writer want the reader to realize or do after reading the poem? And how do you know that? Understanding the writer's persona, recognizing the poem's audience, these are key to answering questions about the poem's purpose. And does the man moth have a purpose? I say yes, of course it does. As I said earlier, much of the poem is devoted to describing the habitat and habits of the man moth, where he lives, what he does, what he thinks and feels. But more than that, however, Bishop wants us to understand and pity his existence, to commiserate with his sorrow, which most of the time he experiences alone, swallowing his own tears. In the last stanza, which I talked about in the previous slide, she urges the reader to reach out to this strange, lonely man who keeps his hands in his pockets. If one could just touch him, cry with him, perhaps his humanity might be restored. That kind of connection, which is so hard to maintain living in large populous cities, enables hope and love and gives people something to live for. So that's what I see as the purpose of the poem. So starting the explication. Once you have done the preliminaries and identified the poem's genre, persona, audience, and purpose, it is time to begin the explication itself. You shouldn't begin until you understand how the content of the poem is organized and how that might shape your writing about it. A straightforward explication should follow the structure of the poem from start to finish, and stanza breakage will often help with the organization of an essay. If the poem is divided into stanzas, you can explicate it one stanza at a time. And if it is not divided into stanzas, another useful strategy is to go sentence by sentence, recognizing that poetic sentences often will run for multiple lines. So if you can't explicate it by stanza, you can explicate it by groupings of lines. And you'll need to decide how you're going to do that before you start writing an explication. As I said earlier, the man moth is divided into 6 stanzas of 8 lines. And during my initial reading of the poem, I noticed that each stanza tells the reader something new about the man moth, or since it's a lyric poem, the writer's thoughts about him. And this will help me to organize my explication. And I'll just give you some examples. I don't go through all the stanzas here, but I thought this first stanza is basically a description of moonlight in the city. Stanza number 3, description of the man moth climbing a building to reach the moon. Stanza number 5, a description of the man moth riding a subway train, just a general sense of what each stanza is about. And then I'm going to write a short summary of one. So following that organization, the 6-stanza organization, I'm going to explicate it stanza by stanza. So at a minimum then, my explication will be written in 6 paragraphs. But if I have several points to make about one stanza, more paragraphs may be required. My explication would therefore begin with a summary of the first stanza. And summarizing is a way of condensing and simplifying content, making it shorter and easier to understand. So there's the first stanza. I'm going to summarize that in a moment for you if you want to pause and just read that highlighted section again. Remember, summary should be written mostly in your own words, not the poet's. If you do use some of the poet's words, just be very, very choice in which words you use, and don't forget to put them in quotation marks with correct parenthetical citations. In the example that I give you here, I don't use any of the poet's words. I write, in the opening stanza, Bishop describes a night scene in a large city. The people who live there, dwarfed by tall buildings, wander about in the moonlight, but seem completely oblivious to the moon's beauty. One of them sees the light shining on his hands, but for some reason never bothers looking up to discover its source. That is my short summary of that stanza. Having summarized the first stanza, then, the next step is to look more closely at how the poet uses language to develop more nuanced and complicated meanings. To do this, one must possess a basic understanding of figurative language. And in this video series, I use the terms figures of speech, figurative language, and literary devices synonymously. So just if you get a little confused, it's just professional habit that I use all these terms pretty much interchangeably. Figurative language, figures of speech, and literary devices. And that's going to be the topic of part 2 of this video series.